Hello and welcome to this video on Azalea as a species for bonsai. Azalea are a very pretty plant. They bloom throughout the entirety of spring, and depending on where you are, you can either have slightly earlier and certainly much later blooming of flowers. This means that you get a long-lasting, very impressive display for a species that is relatively tolerant of most things you can do to it. Admittedly, they do prefer shade, but other than throwing some shade at them, you don't have much to worry about. They are part of the larger family of Araceae, and they fall under the rhododendron genus. You'll find that there are about 1,000 particular species that make this up, so you have a lot of options to choose from. However, for the most part, there are only a few used for the purposes of bonsai. Satsuki is particularly popular, along with kurume and the kaempferi azaleas. As a general rule, you're probably going to see more of the satsuki and kurume than you are anything else. This is owing to their leaf size and flower size that mesh well together for bonsai. Azalea is popular, let's say that, for its very, very pretty flowers. They are generally well matched in size to the tree you're growing. They do last quite a while, and they are very colourful. This means that you get a strong, potent display for relatively little effort compared to other flowering species. This is why they're especially popular in Japan, where there are not only specialised species that have been developed for this, or perhaps it'd be better to say cultivars, but there are even more specialised bonsai festivals dedicated to azaleas in particular. You do, however, need to support the azalea for this to happen. That is, you need to prune it well and fertilise well. The colours of the azalea itself are fairly straightforward. Most of the leaves are going to be a dark green, although you may find them as light as a very shiny silver olive colour. But they do differ in size and shape. Generally speaking, though, you will find that they're very much a typical shape, something like this. They are nearly always evergreen, which is helpful as you can keep them going in most conditions as a result. However, they can't be kept indoors as a result of that as well. Azalea suits anything except for root over rock, and that owes to the rather delicate nature of their roots. You can, and you arguably should, be growing your azalea outdoors in just about all conditions, but you do need to give them shade. That's because they need that protection not only for their leaves, but for their root mass. This is also a byproduct of how they grow in the wild. That is largely in wooded areas where they're protected by much larger trees. These trees also point out something you need to apply for your bonsai azalea. That is, during periods of extreme cold, you should move them to somewhere where they're protected from the worst of the weather. Largely thinking of things like frost, which will damage the tips of the branches, and to a certain extent, they'll harm not only the tree, but your flowering display as well. The azalea needs to be watered carefully, and this is the big problem with them. You can't water them too much, and you can't water them too little. They are very finicky. If you keep them permanently wet, the root ball will start to rot, and it does this very easily. If you let it get too dry, it will unfortunately begin to die as well, and by too dry we mean relatively mild levels of dryness. If you want to make sure that your azalea is well cared for, you can take a rather extreme approach, which is to let it dry considerably more than you should, and then soak the entirety of the pot in water to thoroughly moisten it a second time after normal watering. This will largely help to avoid the issue of having to worry about continuously watering it and therefore allowing roots to rot, but you do run the risk of the roots getting too dry and experiencing dieback, which will harm the tree's growth. A more modest and consistent watering schedule is perhaps more appropriate. The other caveat to this, though, is that azaleas need acidified soil, and unfortunately, tap water, if it has considerable amounts of mineral content, is nearly always basic. This means you can't use tap water as is. You either have to add something to the soil to acidify it, or you need to use something like rainwater, which is generally going to be neutral, and then hopefully have amended your soil to have something slightly acidic in it. You'll find that azaleas are actually interesting in the way they grow, and this is something you need to adjust for when pruning. Their growth is called basally dominant, and this is a fancy way of saying the branches lower down and more developed grow much more aggressively than the less developed and higher up branches of the azalea. This means that you need to prune the lower branches more aggressively than those at the top end, and this is because you're trying to curtail the growth and the dedication of energy from the root mass into these branches and force it to go to the top. The fact is that most azalea will be fairly resilient to whatever pruning you do to them anyway, so this isn't a big problem, but you do need to be aware that this is something you need to apply focus to when pruning. You also want to immediately prune any flowers once they've started to wilt. These can either be cut off or pinched out by hand. It doesn't really matter which way you go, so long as you remove them, as they will again be a drain on energy that could be better put into keeping the plant otherwise healthy or growing. The best time for pruning is generally going to be in summer. This is for two reasons. The first is that you avoid any issues around the loss of water or overwatering them, and therefore you maintain the tree's status quo as far as water goes much better. The other, though, is that you won't be harming the points at which flower buds will appear, and this means that you have a better chance of getting a nice display come next season. If you prune too late, there'll be no flowers at all, so this is the challenge you face. Too early, and you'll get lots of growth that you don't want. Too late, and you won't get flowers. One of the ways to compensate for this, and to a certain extent you'll have to do it anyway, given the voracious growth of most azaleas, is with fertilizers. You do, however, have to use something of a specialized fertilizer for most azaleas, although you may also find it sold as a rhododendron fertilizer. The two are effectively synonymous. They're used weekly, or ideally bi-weekly, with every other week something used to stimulate growth of the root mass, and therefore you get not only supported growth, but you'll get plenty of flowers as well. You should, as said, remove any growth you don't want, and this can be done most of the time of the year. Ideally not in the middle of winter or during periods of extreme wet, but otherwise you don't need to worry too much. Most of the extreme styling is generally done in spring, and this is done largely because the new growth in spring is flexible and pliable. The more developed wood of the azalea is generally brittle, and so wiring it is, let's say, a dangerous task, and often leads to broken branches rather than styling. As mentioned, prune back at the end of the flowering period, or when flowers begin to die off. You can either work on it progressively or at one time. Either way, it's not going to make a huge difference other than whether you want to try and minimize the work in one day or get it over in one go. If you find that the tree is struggling to produce new flowers, you may need to cut back aggressively towards points on the branch where you'll have to start growing it out again from. This will have a support better ramification and should to a certain extent result in reduction in leaf size. Overall, wiring is not really advisable for azaleas. As mentioned, the harder branches and the more developed branches, generally those from the previous growing season, tend to be too brittle and will snap. It can be done, but it's not ideal. Wiring is always done with the either a current season or the very thin and pliable growth from previous growing seasons. You don't even really need wire in a lot of cases. You can get away with just pruning and waiting for growth. Every other year or thereabouts for the earlier azaleas, that's those that are less than 5 to 10 years old, you'll need to repot every 2 years. Once you get to that older age bracket, you'll be looking to repot every 5 years or thereabouts. This will, however, depend on the soil conditions, the growth of the tree, how much the root mass has grown, and so on. The difficulty with repotting is not so much that it needs to be done, rather that the roots are relatively delicate and can be very easily torn and shredded when trying to disentangle them. To a certain extent, you may not even want to try that, rather taking a relatively sharp knife or a decent saw and cutting the third of the root mass off that way. As far as pests go, you don't have a lot to worry about. They're not really infected by anything unusual or special. The only important thing about them is that they don't like basic contents in either their water or soil. This means you generally need to use specialized soil for azaleas, and avoid anything that would make it, well, basic or alkali. The addition of something acidic or similar is going to help in that respect. Watering, you have the same issue, and you may find that you need to either use rainwater and hope that the soil amendments work, or additions to the water to try and acidify it just slightly. Overall, with a little bit of care and knowledge about the particularities of what azalea need as far as acid goes, they can be beginner friendly, and they obviously have a very desirable display. Since you don't need wire and you can get away with pruning, you don't need any special tools. You just need a bit of patience and a bit of attention. However, once you start getting into the details and more advanced species, you may need some more knowledge and experience to get the most out of it. But these are something that spreads across the spectrum of capacity for all, and therefore it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to say they're not beginner friendly, they're just not necessarily beginner ideal. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.